Analysis: how the White House is using misleading comparisons to make inflation sound better. When President Donald Trump returned to the White House, the year-over-year inflation rate in January stood at 3%. 8 months later, in September, the most recent month with available consumer price index data, the inflation rate was still 3%. In other words, inflation had not declined from the level Trump inherited. This reality contradicts Trump's repeated claims that inflation has stopped after he took office and that he inherited the worst inflation in the history of our country. Since the direct comparison does not support those claims, the White House has instead relied on selective and misleading statistical comparisons to present a more favorable picture. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt demonstrated this approach during a press briefing on Thursday. When CNN's Caitlin Collins pointed out that inflation remains roughly the same as last year, grocery prices are higher, and economic signals are mixed, Leavitt argued that inflation has fallen to an average of 2.5%. She said Trump inherited inflation at around 2.9% and that it has since slowed, claiming the trend is moving in the right direction. However, the data do not support this narrative. According to CPI figures, inflation has actually increased for 5 consecutive months. The year-over-year rate rose from 2.3% in April to 2.4% in May, then climbed to 2.67% in June, 2.7% in July, 2.9% in August, and reached 3% again in September. This pattern shows acceleration, not improvement. So where did the White House's 2.5% figure come from? Leavitt later clarified that she was referring to an average inflation rate across Trump's first 8 months in office, rather than the most recent monthly figure. That means she compared January's single-month inflation rate to an average covering February through September, a comparison that is not equivalent. This averaging method also minimizes the current inflation problem because it includes the lower inflation rates from Trump's first few months back in office, before and shortly after he announced sweeping global tariffs in early April. Inflation began rising noticeably in May, making the average appear more favorable than the current reality. There is another issue with the 2.5% claim. It is not even a simple average of the past 8 months. A straightforward arithmetic average of those monthly rates comes out closer to 2.7%. That 2.7% figure was actually used by the White House in a social media graphic and mentioned by Leavitt earlier in the same briefing. The administration later explained that the 2.5% number was an annualized rate, though Leavitt did not use that term when speaking publicly. That same social media graphic presented an even more misleading comparison. In large text, it stated 9.1% inflation under Biden and 2.7% inflation under Trump. Only in much smaller text did it explain the different time frames being compared. The 2.7% figure reflects the average inflation rate during Trump's current term. But the 9.1% figure refers to a single peak month during the Biden presidency, June 2022. The graphic did not mention that inflation later fell sharply under Biden, dropping to 3% by June 2023, declining further to 2.4% in September 2024, and ending Biden's term at 3% in January 2025. Leavitt repeated this peak versus average comparison in the briefing, saying inflation hit a record 9% under Biden but averaged just 2.7% under Trump. While both numbers are technically accurate, the comparison is misleading because it contrasts Biden's worst single month with Trump's multi-month average without explaining the context.